The planet Zarnith was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. Smoke rose from the ground, the air thick with the smell of burnt metal and ash. The war had left the once beautiful planet a wasteland. Blackened trees stood like skeletons, and craters dotted the earth where bombs had fallen. It was a place where life seemed impossible, yet Sergeant Michael Carter kept moving. Michael was a soldier in the United Earth Defense Forces, but now he was the only one left from his platoon. The rest of his team had been wiped out in a surprise attack just 3 days ago. He was alone behind enemy lines, armed only with a rifle, a half-empty medkit, and the will to survive. His mission now was simple: make it back to human-controlled space alive. The silence was unsettling. Michael scanned his surroundings, his sharp blue eyes constantly moving. He had been a soldier for a long time, and knew that silence didn't mean safety. It often meant a trap. The alien race humans were fighting. The Krulthans were ruthless and cunning. They wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone they found, even a lone soldier like him. Then Michael heard something that made him stop. At first, he thought it was the wind, but as he listened closer, he realized it was a sound, a faint, soft sound. It wasn't mechanical, and it wasn't the noise of the battlefield. It sounded like crying. His instincts told him to ignore it. He couldn't afford distractions, but something deep inside him wouldn't let him move on. Against his better judgment, Michael followed the sound. He stepped carefully over broken pieces of metal and fallen beams, moving closer to the source. The crying grew louder, but it was still weak, almost like whoever was making the sound was struggling to breathe. Finally, Michael found the source, a figure lying among the rubble. It wasn't human. The figure was a slender, pale-skinned alien woman. Her silver hair was tangled and stained with dirt, and her shimmering green eyes barely stayed open. She was dressed in what looked like a torn research uniform, and her body was covered in wounds. A long gash ran across her side, and her breathing was shallow. She looked up at Michael with a mixture of fear and desperation. Michael hesitated. She wasn't Krulthan, that much was clear. But she wasn't human either. His orders had been clear: prioritize human lives and ignore everything else. Yet here she was, hurt and abandoned, and he could see in her eyes that she had been left to die. "Please," she whispered, her voice so soft it was barely audible. Her words froze him in place. She was speaking his language, or at least a rough version of it. That alone was enough to catch his attention. Michael crouched down, his rifle still in his hands, and studied her more closely. She was bleeding out, and if he didn't do something, she wouldn't last another hour. He looked around. There were no signs of anyone else nearby. Whoever had left her here wasn't coming back. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low but firm. The alien woman tried to respond, but she coughed weakly instead. Blood trickled from her lips. Michael sighed, realizing he wouldn't get any answers unless he helped her first. He set his rifle down but kept it within reach, pulling out his medkit. His hands moved quickly, cleaning her wounds and applying a field dressing to the worst of them. As he worked, she winced but didn't make a sound. "What's your name?" Michael asked, trying to keep her conscious. "Athea," she managed to whisper. "Athea," he repeated, nodding slightly. "All right, Athea. I don't know why you're here or who left you, but I'm not going to let you die. Not today." She stared at him, confusion flickering in her half-closed eyes. "Why? Help?" she asked weakly. Michael paused. It was a good question. Why was he helping her? She wasn't human, and he had no idea if she was even on their side. But leaving her here felt wrong, like something he couldn't live with. "Because that's what we do," he said simply. Athea didn't respond, but her gaze softened, as if she understood a little. Michael finished patching her up, then slung his rifle over his shoulder and carefully lifted her into his arms. She was surprisingly light, her body trembling slightly as he carried her. The war wasn't over, and they were still deep in enemy territory. But for now, Michael had made his choice. As he moved through the wreckage, Athea's faint breathing reminded him of something humanity often clung to, even in the darkest times: hope. The air on Zarnith was thin, making every breath feel like a struggle. As Michael carried Athea through the ruins, he kept glancing over his shoulder, his senses on high alert. The Krulthans were relentless hunters, and Michael knew it was only a matter of time before they sent patrols to sweep the area. He didn't have much time. Athea, the pale-skinned alien woman in his arms, was barely conscious. Her head rested against his chest, her silver hair streaked with blood and ash. Every so often, she let out a soft groan of pain, but she didn't complain or ask him to stop. "Hang in there," Michael muttered. He wasn't sure if she could even hear him, but talking helped him focus. He pushed through a narrow alley formed by two crumbling buildings. The ground beneath him was unstable, shifting with every step. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the whir of a Krulthan drone. It was scanning the area, its mechanical hum sending a chill down his spine. Michael ducked into the remains of a collapsed structure, carefully lowering Athea onto a relatively clean patch of ground. He placed his rifle within arm's reach and crouched beside her. Athea's green eyes fluttered open, weak but alert. She looked at him. Confusion and fear etched onto her face. "Why? Stop," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael sighed, pulling out a small water pouch from his pack. He held it to her lips, letting her take a few sips. "Because you need help," he said simply. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to figure him out. "Human," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Enemy." Michael frowned. "Enemy? No, not to you." She seemed unconvinced. "Your kind. Fight. Destroy." "Not just us," he shot back, his tone sharper than he intended. "The Krulthans aren't exactly handing out flowers, are they?" Athea flinched, her gaze dropping. Michael immediately regretted his tone. He sighed and leaned back, trying to calm himself. "Look," he said, softer this time, "not all humans are soldiers. Not all of us want war. But right now, I'm all you've got. So if you want to live, you'll have to trust me." Athea didn't respond, but she gave a faint nod. It was enough for Michael. Suddenly, the sound of the drone grew louder, closer. Michael stiffened, grabbing his rifle and peeking through a crack in the wall. The drone hovered in the distance, its red scanning beam sweeping over the ruins. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. He turned back to Athea. "We need to move. Can you walk?" She tried to sit up but winced, her body trembling with the effort. "No, too weak," she admitted. Michael cursed silently. Carrying her again would slow him down, but leaving her behind wasn't an option. He adjusted the straps on his pack and slung his rifle across his back. Then, without a word, he scooped her up once more. Athea's voice was faint in his ear. "You? Foolish." Michael smirked despite himself. "Yeah, I get that a lot." He moved quickly but carefully, keeping to the shadows as he navigated through the ruins. The drone's hum grew fainter, and Michael allowed himself to relax. Just a little. After what felt like an eternity, he found a small, abandoned bunker partially buried in the ground. Its entrance was hidden beneath debris, but Michael managed to clear it enough to slip inside. The air was stale, but it was better than being exposed outside. He set Athea down gently on a makeshift bed of old fabric. She let out a sigh of relief, her body visibly relaxing. As Michael began checking her bandages, she spoke again. "Athea," she said softly. He looked at her. "What?" "My name." "Athea," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. Michael nodded. "I remember. I'm Michael. Sergeant Michael Carter." "Michael," she said, as if testing the name. "You, strange human." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're not the first to say that, either." Athea's gaze softened, and for the first time, Michael saw something other than fear in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Before he could respond, A distant explosion rattled the bunker, followed by the unmistakable sound of Krelthan soldiers shouting orders. Michael's smile vanished. He grabbed his rifle and peeked outside. Through the crack, he saw movement, several Krelthans sweeping the area with their weapons drawn. "They're here," he said grimly. Athia's face tightened with fear. "Leave me. Save yourself." "Not a chance," Michael replied firmly. "I didn't carry you this far to give up now." He tightened his grip on his rifle, his mind racing. If the Krelthans found them, they wouldn't stand a chance. But Michael wasn't about to go down without a fight. "Stay quiet," he whispered to Athia. "I'll handle this." She stared at him, her expression a mix of fear and awe. For the first time, she began to wonder if humans were more than the destroyers she had been taught to fear. Michael pressed his back against the cold wall of the bunker, his rifle steady in his hands. The distant sound of Krelthan soldiers grew louder as they searched the ruins outside. Their guttural voices barked commands, and the glow of their scanning devices lit up the night. He glanced back at Athia, who lay on the makeshift bed, her silver hair dull under the dim light. Her breathing was slow and shallow, but her eyes were locked on him. She was scared, but she didn't look away. "You're going to have to trust me," Michael whispered, his voice low but steady. Athia didn't respond, but there was a flicker of something in her expression. Perhaps she already did. The first Krelthan soldier appeared outside the bunker's entrance, its tall, insect-like frame outlined against the night sky. Its glowing eyes swept the area, and it raised a plasma rifle, ready to fire at any sign of movement. Michael's grip on his weapon tightened. He had fought Krelthans before, and he knew how fast and deadly they were. A firefight here, with Athia injured and unable to move, would be suicide. He needed a plan. The soldier moved closer, its heavy footsteps crunching against the rubble. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he calculated his options. The bunker was small, with only one exit. If they were discovered, there would be no escape. Athia's voice broke the silence, a whisper so soft he almost missed it. "I can help." Michael turned to her, frowning. "You can barely sit up." Her green eyes glowed faintly in the dark. "My implants, I can disrupt their scanners. But it will hurt." Michael hesitated. He didn't like the idea of her pushing herself further when she was already so weak. But the alternative was worse. "Do it," he said finally, "but only if you're sure." Athia nodded, her hands trembling as she touched the small, glowing interface on her wrist. She closed her eyes, and her breathing grew uneven. A faint hum filled the air, and Michael felt a static charge prickling his skin. Outside, the Krelthan soldier froze, its scanner flickering erratically. It let out a sharp, frustrated screech, signaling to its comrades. The disruption spread like a ripple, and Michael could hear more soldiers shouting in confusion. "It's working," he whispered, impressed. But Athia's body convulsed, and she let out a pained gasp. Michael rushed to her side, grabbing her hand to steady her. "Athia, stop," he said firmly. "You've done enough." She opened her eyes, barely able to speak. "Not yet." The disruption gave Michael the opening he needed. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, grabbed a small EMP grenade from his pack, and crawled toward the bunker's entrance. Peeking out, he saw 3 Krelthans, their scanners still glitching. With a practiced throw, Michael lobbed the grenade into the center of the group. The device went off with a sharp crack, and the Krelthans dropped to the ground, their suits and weapons disabled. Michael didn't waste a second. He rushed out, finishing the disoriented soldiers with precise shots before they could recover. The glow in their eyes faded as they collapsed into the rubble. He stood over the bodies, breathing hard, and scanned the area for any more threats. The night was silent again, but he knew it wouldn't last. The Krelthans never operated alone. Reinforcements were probably on their way. Michael hurried back into the bunker, where Athia lay motionless. His chest tightened at the sight of her pale, lifeless form. "Athia," he said, kneeling beside her. Her eyes fluttered open, weak but alive. "I still here," she whispered with a faint smile. Michael let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You scared the hell out of me." She gave a faint chuckle, but it quickly turned into a cough. "You, humans, always dramatic." He shook his head, a small grin forming despite the situation. "And you aliens always take unnecessary risks." Athea's expression softened. "We saved each other," she said quietly. Michael nodded, realizing she was right. In just a few hours, this stranger, this alien, had become his partner in survival. He didn't know much about her, but he knew one thing. He couldn't leave her behind. As he patched up her wounds again, she spoke. "Michael, why do you fight?" The question caught him off guard. He thought for a moment before answering. "For my people. For those who can't fight for themselves. And sometimes, just because it's the right thing to do." Athea looked at him, her green eyes filled with curiosity. Strange, but admirable. Michael stood, his rifle in hand, and glanced at the horizon. The ruins stretched endlessly, and the path ahead would be dangerous. But for the first time in days, he didn't feel alone. "Rest while you can," he said to Athea. "We're moving at first light." She nodded weakly, closing her eyes. Michael leaned against the wall, watching over her. The war was far from over, but tonight they had won a small battle. And in the quiet of the bunker, a bond was forged, one that would carry them through the fire yet to come. The first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, painting the ruins of Zarnith in shades of gold and gray. Michael adjusted the straps on his pack, his rifle slung securely across his shoulder. The night had been quiet after the skirmish, but he knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The Krelthans wouldn't stop searching for them. He glanced at Athea, who was leaning against a broken wall for support. Her color was returning, and though her movements were slow, there was a spark of determination in her green eyes. "You sure you're ready for this?" Michael asked. She nodded, brushing silver hair from her face. "I can walk now," she said. Her voice was steadier than it had been the night before. Michael wasn't entirely convinced, but they didn't have the luxury of waiting. Every moment spent in the ruins increased the chance of being found. "All right," he said, offering her his hand. "But if you feel weak, let me know. I'll carry you again." Athea hesitated, then took his hand, letting him help her stand. "You don't give up, do you?" "Not when lives are on the line," he replied with a faint grin. Together, they moved cautiously through the shattered landscape. The air was heavy with the smell of burnt metal and ash, and the ground was uneven, littered with debris from battles long past. Every step was a reminder of the war that had ravaged this world. Athea walked beside Michael, her movements slow but steady. She kept her eyes on the path ahead, but Michael could see the way her fingers trembled slightly. "Tell me something," he said, breaking the silence. "How did you end up here? You're not Krelthan, but you're on their planet." Athea glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "I am a scientist," she said finally. "My people, my ship, were traveling through this sector when we were attacked. The Krelthans captured me, said I could help them." "Help them with what?" Michael asked, his brow furrowing. "Weapons," she said bitterly. "They wanted to use my knowledge to create something more powerful. I refused, so they discarded me." Michael frowned, his grip tightening on his rifle. He had seen the cruelty of the Krelthans firsthand, but hearing it from Athea made his anger burn even hotter. "They left you to die because you wouldn't help them," he said, his voice laced with disbelief. Athea nodded. "They see no value in what they cannot control." "Well, they're wrong," Michael said firmly. "You're worth saving." She looked at him, her green eyes softening. "You are strange, Michael Carter. Most beings I have met care only for themselves." "Maybe I'm just stubborn," he said with a shrug, trying to lighten the mood. Athea smiled faintly, But their brief moment of calm was interrupted by a distant sound, a low mechanical hum. Michael froze, motioning for Athia to stop. "What is it?" she whispered. "Drone," he said grimly. He crouched low, pulling Athia down with him. The hum grew louder, and soon, a Krelthan patrol drone appeared over the horizon, its red scanning beams sweeping the ruins. Michael's mind raced. They couldn't outrun the drone. It would see them in an instant. He scanned the area and spotted an old drainage pipe partially buried in rubble. "Over there," he whispered, pointing. Athia followed his gaze and nodded. Together, they crawled toward the pipe, moving as quickly and quietly as possible. The ground was sharp and uneven, scraping against their skin, but they didn't stop. The drone's scanning beam passed just above them as they reached the pipe. Michael shoved aside debris, creating enough space for them to crawl inside. The pipe was damp and narrow, but it offered cover. They pressed themselves against the cold metal walls, holding their breath as the drone hovered nearby. Its red beam passed over the entrance, lingering for a moment. Michael's hand tightened around his rifle, ready to fire if they were discovered. The drone let out a series of beeps before moving on, its hum fading into the distance. Michael exhaled slowly, his muscles relaxing. "That was close," he muttered. Athia nodded, her face pale but calm. "You are resourceful," she said quietly. "Comes with the job," he replied. They stayed in the pipe for a few more minutes, waiting to make sure the drone was gone. When the silence stretched on, Michael peeked outside. The coast was clear. "Let's move," he said, helping Athia out of the pipe. As they resumed their journey, the landscape began to change. The ruins gave way to rocky hills, and the ground became harder to traverse. Michael's boots crunched against loose gravel, and Athia stumbled more than once, but she always caught herself. "Not far now," Michael said, trying to reassure her. "Where are we going?" she asked. "There's a human outpost about 10 clicks from here," he said. "If we can reach it, we'll be safe." Athia frowned. "And what happens to me?" Michael stopped, turning to face her. "You come with me," he said. "I'll make sure you're protected." Athia studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you, Michael Carter." He gave her a small smile. "We're in this together, Athia." As they pressed on, the bond between them grew stronger. The war-torn world around them seemed determined to break them, but together they found the strength to keep moving. The rocky hills stretched endlessly ahead, jagged and unforgiving under the harsh midday sun. Michael's boots crunched against the gravel as he guided Athia up yet another incline. The human outpost wasn't far now, but every step felt heavier with the weight of exhaustion and danger. Behind him, Athia struggled to keep pace. Though her strength had improved, her wounds and the harsh terrain were taking their toll. She stumbled on a loose rock, barely catching herself before she fell. Michael turned quickly, steadying her with a firm hand. "You all right?" Athia nodded. Her breathing labored. "I will manage," she said, her voice determined despite her exhaustion. Michael studied her for a moment before reaching into his pack and pulling out a small energy bar. "Here," he said, handing it to her. "You need to eat." Athia hesitated, her gaze shifting between the bar and Michael. "You give your food to me." Michael chuckled. "Yeah. It's not like I'm running on a full tank either, but you need it more." She took the bar, her fingers brushing against his briefly. "Thank you," she said softly. "Don't mention it," he replied, turning to scout the path ahead. As they moved forward, a sudden gust of wind swept through the hills, carrying with it a strange metallic tang. Michael stopped, his senses immediately on high alert. "What is it?" Athia asked, noticing his tense posture. "Something's wrong," he said, scanning the horizon. His instincts, honed through years of combat, were screaming at him. A low rumble echoed in the distance, followed by the faint sound of engines. Michael's eyes narrowed as he spotted a plume of dust rising over the next ridge. "Krelthan patrol," he muttered. Athea's face paled. "How many?" "Too many," he replied grimly. He grabbed her hand, pulling her toward a cluster of boulders. "We need to hide." They crouched behind the rocks as the rumble grew louder. A Krelthan convoy came into view, a line of armored vehicles bristling with weaponry. Soldiers perched on top, their glowing eyes scanning the area. Michael tightened his grip on his rifle, his mind racing. They couldn't fight their way through, not against those odds. But staying still wasn't an option either. Athea leaned closer to him, her voice barely a whisper. "I can create another disruption. It will draw their attention away." Michael frowned, shaking his head. "No, you're still recovering. You could hurt yourself again." Her green eyes met his, filled with resolve. "We will not survive if they find us. Let me help." He hesitated, torn between his instinct to protect her and the reality of their situation. Finally, he nodded. "All right. But if it gets too much, stop. Promise me." "I promise," she said. Athea activated her implants again, her body trembling as a faint hum filled the air. The Krelthan vehicles slowed, their scanners glitching and weapons misfiring. Confusion spread through the convoy as soldiers barked orders, trying to figure out what was happening. Michael used the distraction to lead Athea down a narrow path, keeping low to avoid detection. The terrain grew steeper, and loose rocks tumbled down the slope with every step. Behind them, the Krelthan soldiers began spreading out, searching for the source of the disruption. "We're almost there," Michael whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "Just a little further." Athea stumbled again, and this time Michael caught her before she hit the ground. Her face was pale, and sweat dripped down her brow. "I can't. Keep it up," she gasped. "Then stop," Michael said firmly. He helped her lean against a boulder, his expression softening. "You've done enough. Athea, rest. I'll handle the rest." She looked at him, her lips trembling as if she wanted to argue, but she nodded. The hum from her implants faded, leaving only the sound of their ragged breathing. Michael crouched beside her, pulling out a small map from his pack. He traced a path with his finger, calculating their position. "We're close," he said. "The outpost is just beyond that ridge." Athea forced herself to sit up, her gaze following his hand. "Then we go," she said, her voice steadier than before. Michael smiled faintly. "That's the spirit." The two of them pressed on, their movements slower but deliberate. The ridge loomed ahead, a steep climb that would test their endurance. Michael glanced back at Athea, concern etched on his face. "You ready for this?" he asked. She nodded, her green eyes blazing with determination. "I will not fall behind." Together, they began the ascent, their hands gripping rocks and jagged outcroppings for support. The climb was brutal, every muscle in their bodies screaming for relief. As they reached the top, Michael pulled himself over the edge and turned to help Athea. She grabbed his hand, her grip strong despite her exhaustion. When they finally stood on the ridge, the sight before them took their breath away. The human outpost lay nestled in a valley below, its metal walls gleaming in the sunlight. "We made it," Michael said, relief flooding his voice. Athea smiled faintly, but her expression grew serious. "The Krelthans will not stop. They will follow." Michael nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then we'll be ready for them." As they began their descent toward the outpost, a dark shadow passed over the horizon. A massive Krelthan warship, its engines roaring as it hovered ominously above the ruins. Michael's heart sank. The storm wasn't over yet. The human outpost was so close now, its metal walls shimmering in the sunlight. It stood like a beacon of hope in the desolate valley below. But Michael and Athea had no time to celebrate. The deep, thunderous roar of the Krelthan warship above filled the air. Its engines created a low hum that rattled the rocks beneath their feet. From its belly, smaller ships began descending, carrying squads of Krelthan soldiers. Michael's heart pounded as he pulled Athia into cover behind a jagged boulder. The ridge offered no real protection. If the Krelthans scanned the area, they'd be found in seconds. "They're sending everything after us," Michael muttered. Athia leaned against the boulder, her face pale but her eyes sharp. "They must have realized I am still alive. They will not allow us to escape." Michael glanced at her, his jaw tightening. "We're not giving them the chance. If we reach the outpost, we can warn the others and get reinforcements." Athia nodded, but hesitated. "Michael, what if I am the reason they are coming? If they find me, more lives will be lost." Michael crouched beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Athia, listen to me. This isn't your fault. The Krelthans were hunting us before they knew who you were. They don't need an excuse to destroy." Her expression softened, but there was still doubt in her eyes. "We're getting through this," Michael said firmly. "Together." She took a deep breath and nodded. "Together." Michael peered over the edge of the ridge. The descent to the valley would be treacherous, with little cover between them and the outpost. Worse, the Krelthans were already spreading out, their glowing scanners sweeping the hills. He spotted a narrow path cutting through the rocks, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. It wasn't ideal, but it was their best shot. "Follow me," he said, helping Athia to her feet. They moved quickly, keeping low as they made their way down the path. Every step sent loose gravel tumbling down the slope, and Michael winced at the sound, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they hadn't been spotted. The Krelthan warship loomed above, its shadow casting an ominous darkness over the valley. Suddenly, a bright beam of light shot down from the ship, striking the ground not far from them. The explosion sent a shockwave through the air, knocking both Michael and Athia to the ground. Michael scrambled to his feet, pulling Athia up with him. "They're trying to flush us out," he shouted over the ringing in his ears. Athia's gaze darted toward the outpost in the distance. "We must keep moving." The ground shook again as another blast landed closer. Michael gritted his teeth and pushed forward, gripping Athia's arm to keep her steady. As they reached the base of the ridge, a group of Krelthan soldiers appeared ahead, their glowing eyes locking onto the pair. "Get down," Michael barked, shoving Athia behind a large rock. The Krelthans opened fire, their plasma bolts scorching the ground around them. Michael returned fire with precision, taking down 2 soldiers with clean headshots. "Athia," he called out, reloading his rifle. "Can you disrupt them again?" She peeked out from cover, her hands trembling. "I can try." Michael gave her an encouraging nod. "You've got this." Athia activated her implants, her body trembling with effort. The air crackled with energy as the Krelthan soldiers froze, their weapons flickering and failing. Michael didn't waste the opportunity. He charged forward, taking out the remaining soldiers with quick, calculated shots. When the last one fell, he turned back to Athia, who was slumped against the rock, breathing heavily. "Are you okay?" he asked, rushing to her side. She nodded weakly. "I will recover." Michael helped her to her feet, his gaze shifting to the outpost. They were close now, less than a kilometer away. He could see human soldiers on the walls, their weapons aimed at the approaching Krelthans. "We're almost there," he said, determination lighting up his face. They began the final sprint, their footsteps kicking up dust as they raced toward the outpost. The ground behind them erupted in explosions as the Krelthan warship fired again, but they didn't stop. The gates of the outpost opened just as they reached it, and human soldiers rushed out to meet them. "Get inside," one of the soldiers shouted, covering them with suppressive fire. Michael and Athia stumbled through the gates, collapsing onto the ground as the heavy metal doors slammed shut behind them. "We made it," Michael panted, his chest heaving. Athia looked at him, her face pale but her lips curling into a small smile. "You kept your promise." Before Michael could respond, an officer approached, his face grim. "Soldier, who's the alien?" "She's with me," Michael said firmly, standing protectively in front of Athia. And she just helped us survive a Krulthan assault. The officer hesitated, then nodded. All right, get inside and rest. We'll hold them off for now, but this isn't over. As Michael and Athia were led deeper into the outpost, the sound of battle raged outside. They had reached safety, for now, but the war wasn't done with them yet. The air inside the human outpost was thick with tension. Soldiers scrambled to their positions, shouting orders as the Krulthan warship loomed above. Michael sat in the infirmary, his rifle leaning against the wall. Athia lay on a cot nearby, her silver hair damp with sweat, her breathing shallow but steady. "You're a magnet for trouble, you know that," Michael said with a faint smile, his voice soft to avoid disturbing the medics tending to her. Athia opened her eyes, her green gaze meeting his. "And yet you stayed," she said, her voice weak but touched with warmth. Michael chuckled. "Yeah, well, maybe I've got a thing for impossible odds." Before Athia could reply, the intercom crackled to life. "All personnel to battle stations. Krulthan forces are advancing." Michael stood immediately, his expression hardening. He grabbed his rifle and turned to Athia. "Stay here. You're safe as long as the walls hold." She reached out, her fingers brushing his arm. "Michael, be careful." He nodded, his grip tightening on the weapon. "I'll come back. I promise." Michael sprinted to the command center, where a large holographic map displayed the approaching Krulthan forces. The warship hovered ominously, its smaller crafts releasing waves of soldiers and armored vehicles. The officer from earlier turned to Michael. "Good timing. You know the Krulthans better than most. Any ideas?" Michael studied the map, his mind racing. "They'll hit hard and fast, trying to overwhelm us. But they're relying on their tech. If we disrupt their systems, we can level the playing field." The officer nodded. "We've got EMP charges, but they're short range. Someone would need to get close." Michael's jaw tightened. "I'll do it." "Are you sure?" the officer asked. Michael glanced toward the infirmary, where Athia was resting. "I didn't come this far to lose now." The outpost walls shook as the Krulthans began their assault. Plasma bolts rained down, scorching the ground and battering the defenses. Michael moved through the chaos, dodging explosions as he led a small team toward the enemy line. The plan was simple but dangerous. Get close enough to the warship's command systems to deploy an EMP charge. It was a suicide mission for anyone who hesitated. As they advanced, Michael's comm unit crackled. "Michael," Athia's voice came through, faint but determined. "Athia, you're supposed to be resting," he replied, ducking behind cover as a plasma bolt zipped past. "I can help," she said. "My implants. I can amplify the EMP signal, make it stronger. But you need to reach the warship's core." Michael hesitated. "That's too risky. You're not well enough." "I am alive because of you," she interrupted. "Let me do this. Together, we can end this." Her words lit a fire in him. He couldn't deny the logic, or the courage, behind them. "All right," he said, "but you focus on amplifying the signal. I'll handle the rest." "Agreed," she said. Michael's team pushed forward, using the terrain to their advantage. They moved like shadows, avoiding direct confrontations whenever possible. The warship loomed larger with every step, its weapons tearing into the outpost's defenses. "Keep moving," Michael urged, firing at a Krulthan soldier who had spotted them. Finally, they reached the base of the warship. Its hull was a towering wall of black metal, pulsing with ominous red lights. Michael pulled out the EMP device, his hand steady despite the chaos around him. "Cover me," he shouted to his team. As they opened fire on the approaching Krulthans, Michael attached the device to the warship's core interface, a glowing panel embedded in the hull. "Athia, I'm in position," he said into his comm. "Understood," she replied. Her voice was calm, but he could hear the strain in it. "Activating now." Back at the outpost, Athia sat upright, her body trembling as she connected to the EMP device remotely. Her implants glowed faintly, sensing with the charge. The warship's lights flickered, and the sound of its engines faltered. Krelthan's soldiers froze mid-attack as their weapons short-circuited. "It's working," one of Michael's team members shouted. But the victory was short-lived. The warship's systems began to stabilize, its weapons powering up again. "Athea, we're losing the signal," Michael said urgently. "I need more time," she said, her voice strained. Michael's mind raced. They needed a stronger pulse. Without thinking, he grabbed a secondary charge from his pack and slammed it against the interface. "What are you doing?" a soldier shouted. "Making sure this works," Michael replied. He activated the charge manually, knowing it would overload the system, and himself in the process. "Michael, no." Athea's voice came through the comm, filled with panic. The warship shuddered violently as the combined EMP pulses overloaded its core. Explosions rippled through its structure, and it began to collapse in on itself. Michael's team dragged him away just as the warship crashed to the ground, its destruction sending a shockwave through the valley. Back at the outpost, cheers erupted as the remaining Krelthan forces retreated. Michael stumbled into the infirmary, his body bruised but his spirit unbroken. Athea looked up as he entered, her green eyes filling with relief. You're alive." "Barely," he said with a grin, collapsing onto a nearby cot. She smiled, her hand reaching out to take his. "You kept your promise." "And you kept us alive," he replied. The war wasn't over, but in that moment, they had won. Together, they had defied the odds and given humanity, and each other, a fighting chance.